"Sign the paper, Margaret, or we'll have you removed for trespassing." The words came from Derek's mouth with the casual cruelty of someone who believed he'd already won. The conference room at Holloway and Associates smelled of leather and old money, walls lined with law books no one had touched in decades. Margaret Chen sat alone on one side of the mahogany table, her 72-year-old hands folded in her lap. Across from her, Derek Chen, her stepson, leaned back in his chair like a man at his own coronation. His wife Victoria sat beside him, diamond rings catching the overhead light with every dismissive gesture. The paper between them was a quit-claim deed. Derek had already signed his name at the bottom in bold strokes. "The house was always meant to go to family," Victoria said, her voice honeyed with false sympathy. "Real family. You were only married to his father for, what, 3 years? That hardly counts." Margaret said nothing. She looked at the paper, then at the attorney, a young man named Bradley Fisk, who kept glancing at Derek like a student seeking approval. But what they didn't know was that Margaret had been counting the lies, counting the witnesses Derek had prepared, counting the seconds until truth would crack their carefully built stage. "Mrs. Chen," Fisk began, adjusting his tie, "I understand this is difficult, but Mr. Chen's estate was quite clear in its intentions. The primary residence at 447 Blackwood Drive has been in the Chen family for 40 years. Derek is the biological son and sole heir. Your marriage was brief and there are no children from that union. The most equitable solution is to accept the settlement offered and vacate the property within 30 days. Margaret's eyes moved to Fisk. "Have you read the will?" "Of course I've read it," Fisk said, irritation flickering across his face. "All of it?" Derek laughed. It was a short, sharp sound, designed to make her feel small. "Margaret, stop embarrassing yourself. My father built that company from nothing. He built that house. You were a nurse he met at the hospital during chemo, a companion. We all appreciated what you did for him in his final months, but let's not pretend this was some great romance." Victoria nodded along. "We're being generous with the settlement. $50,000 and your personal belongings. Most widows in your situation would get nothing." Margaret looked down at her hands. They were steady. She had worked as a surgical nurse for 30 years before retiring. She knew what steady hands could do in a crisis. "I'd like to see the original will," she said quietly. "This is the original," Derek snapped. "Stop wasting everyone's time." But Fisk shifted in his seat, just slightly. "The will was filed with the county probate court 6 weeks ago," he said. "Everything is in order. Then you won't mind if I request a certified copy from the court directly?" The room went silent. Derek's smile thinned. "Why would you do that?" "To compare." Victoria's rings stopped flashing. "Are you accusing us of something?" Margaret met her eyes. "I'm asking for a copy of a legal document. If everything is in order, there's nothing to worry about." Derek stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "This is insane. Bradley, can we have her removed from the property tonight?" Fisk hesitated. It was only a second, but Margaret saw it. "Technically, until she signs the quitclaim or a judge orders eviction, she still has residential rights as the surviving spouse." "Then file for eviction," Derek said. "That could take weeks," Fisk replied. "Maybe months if she contests." Derek's jaw tightened. He turned to Margaret, his voice dropping to something colder. "You don't want to do this. You don't want to make this ugly." Margaret stood. She was shorter than both of them, her grey hair pulled back in a simple bun, her cardigan worn at the elbows. She looked exactly like what they thought she was, an old woman with no power and no options. "I'll be staying at the house," she said. "If you need to reach me, you know where I am." She walked out before they could respond. The house at 447 Blackwood Drive was a 3-story Victorian with wraparound porches and windows that caught the afternoon sun. Margaret had lived there for 3 years, but she'd known every corner of it within the first month. Robert Chen had been a complicated man, brilliant, stubborn, and dying. He'd hired her as a private nurse when the hospital could do nothing more. They'd married 8 months later in the living room, witnessed by his lawyer and his accountant. Derek hadn't attended. Now Margaret sat in Robert's study, surrounded by his things, the mahogany desk, the bookshelves, the filing cabinets he'd kept meticulously organized until the cancer made his hands too weak to hold a pen. She opened the bottom drawer and removed a fireproof lockbox. Inside was a single envelope. She'd watched Robert seal it 2 weeks before he died, his breath rattling in his chest. "If anything happens," he'd whispered, Make sure they read all of it. Margaret placed the envelope on the desk and reached for her phone. She dialed a number she'd saved 3 months ago. It rang twice before a woman's voice answered. Law offices of Patricia Moreno. Ms. Moreno, this is Margaret Chen. We spoke in April. Mrs. Chen, Patricia said, her voice sharpening with recognition. Are they making a move? They want me out in 30 days. Do they know? Not yet. Patricia was quiet for a moment. Do you have the documents? All of them. Good. Don't let them take anything from that house. Not a photograph, not a receipt. If Derek tries to enter, call the police. I'll file an emergency motion with probate court tomorrow morning. He has an attorney, Margaret said. Bradley Fisk. Patricia laughed, but there was no humor in it. Bradley Fisk couldn't litigate his way out of a parking ticket. He's a trust fund baby playing lawyer. Robert told me about him. This is going to be easier than I thought. Margaret allowed herself a small smile. What should I expect? They'll push hard before the hearing. Intimidation, mostly. They'll try to make you feel like you're the one breaking the law, but you're not. You're the legal owner of that property, and Derek knows it. That's why he's moving fast. How fast? Fast enough to bury the truth before anyone looks too closely, but we're not going to let that happen. Margaret thanked her and hung up. She sat in the study as the sun dropped below the horizon, the house growing dark around her. Somewhere across town, Derek and Victoria were probably celebrating. They thought they'd cornered her. They thought she was just a frightened old woman who'd sign anything to avoid conflict. What they didn't know was that Robert Chen had spent his final weeks making sure they'd never get away with it, and Margaret had promised him she'd see it through. The next morning, Derek showed up at the house with a locksmith. Margaret heard the truck pull into the driveway just after 8. She was in the kitchen pouring her second cup of tea when the doorbell rang. She didn't answer. Instead, she walked to the front window and looked out. Derek stood on the porch with a man in coveralls carrying a toolbox. Victoria waited by the car, her arms crossed, her expression impatient. Derek rang the bell again, then pounded on the door. "Margaret, open up!" She unlocked the door but left the chain in place, opening it just wide enough to see his face. "Yes? We're changing the locks," Derek said, "for security purposes." "Security from what?" "From squatters," Victoria called from the driveway. "You're not the owner, Margaret. You need to leave." Margaret looked at the locksmith. He was young, uncomfortable, clearly wishing he was anywhere else. "Do you have a work order?" she asked him. He glanced at Derek. "The gentleman said he owns the property." "He doesn't," Margaret said. "I'm the surviving spouse and the current legal resident. If you change these locks without my permission, that's illegal entry. I'll call the police." Derek's face flushed. "You're out of your mind." Margaret pulled her phone from her pocket and held it up. "Would you like me to call now, or would you like to leave?" The locksmith stepped back. "Look, man, I don't want to get involved in family stuff. If there's a legal dispute, you need to handle that first." "There's no dispute," Derek shouted. "This is my father's house." "Then take it up with a judge," Margaret said. She closed the door and locked it. Through the window, she watched Derek argue with the locksmith for another minute before the man packed up his tools and drove away. Victoria stormed up to the porch, but Derek grabbed her arm and pulled her back to the car. They left in a spray of gravel. Margaret returned to the kitchen. Her hands were shaking now, adrenaline catching up to her. She sat down and finished her tea. Her phone buzzed. A text from Patricia Moreno. Emergency motion filed. Hearing set for Friday, 9 a.m. Judge Carver presiding. Don't let them in. Margaret typed back. Understood. The rest of the week was a siege. Derek called 17 times. Margaret didn't answer. He sent emails threatening legal action, claiming she was damaging property, stealing family heirlooms, violating the terms of the estate. Margaret forwarded every message to Patricia. On Wednesday, a process server arrived with eviction papers. Margaret accepted them calmly, signed for them, and called Patricia. "They're trying to intimidate you," Patricia said. "The eviction filing is premature and won't hold up, but they're hoping you'll panic and leave. Don't." "I won't." "Good. I'll see you Friday." Thursday evening, Victoria showed up alone. Margaret saw her through the window, pacing on the porch, looking at her phone. Finally, she knocked. Margaret answered. "Can we talk?" Victoria asked. Her voice was softer now, almost pleading. "Just the two of us. Woman to woman." Margaret stepped outside, leaving the door cracked. "What do you want?" Victoria looked tired. "Look, I know Derek's been intense, but this isn't personal. He's just trying to protect what his father built. You have to understand, this house, the company, it's his legacy, his birthright. Robert had a will, Margaret said. I know, but wills can be contested, especially when there's a new spouse involved. Elderly people can be influenced, taken advantage of. Victoria paused. I'm not saying that's what you did, but a court might see it that way. It could get messy, expensive. You'd have to hire lawyers, go through depositions, have your whole life examined. Is that really what you want at your age? Margaret studied her. Victoria was good. She'd probably practiced this speech in the mirror. What are you offering? 75,000. Cash. You sign the deed, we drop the eviction and you walk away clean. No lawyers, no drama. And if I don't? Victoria's expression hardened just slightly. Then we'll prove Robert wasn't in his right mind when he married you. We'll bring in doctors, medical records, testimony about the morphine doses he was on. We'll show that you manipulated a dying man. By the time we're done, you won't just lose the house. You'll lose everything. Your reputation, your nursing license if you still have it. Everything. Margaret held her gaze. Are you finished? I'm trying to help you. No, Margaret said quietly. You're trying to scare me. And it's not going to work. She went back inside and locked the door. Through the window, she watched Victoria stand there for a long moment, her mask finally slipping, her face twisting with frustration. Then she walked back to her car and drove away. Margaret sat in the study and opened the lockbox again. Inside, beneath the envelope, was a small digital recorder. She pressed play. Robert's voice filled the room, thin and hoarse, but clear. This is Robert Chen, recorded on March 14th. I'm of sound mind, though my body is failing. I'm making this recording because I know my son will try to contest my will. Derek has always believed he was entitled to everything I built, but he doesn't know what I know. He doesn't know what I've discovered. Margaret stopped the recording. She'd listened to it a dozen times since Robert died, but she'd never played it for anyone else. Not yet. Friday morning arrived cold and grey. Margaret dressed carefully. A navy suit, simple jewellery, her hair pinned back. She looked like a woman who'd spent decades in hospitals, in operating rooms, in places where precision and calm were matters of life and death. Patricia met her outside the courthouse. She was in her 50s, sharp-eyed, with silver streaks in her dark hair. Ready? Yes. Derek's going to try to rattle you. Don't let him. Just answer the questions I've prepared you for. Nothing more. They walked inside together. The probate courtroom was smaller than Margaret had expected, wood-panelled and formal. Derek and Victoria were already there, sitting with Bradley Fisk. Derek wore a tailored suit and an expression of smug confidence. When he saw Margaret, he leaned over and whispered something to Victoria. She smiled. Judge Carver entered at exactly 9. She was a black woman in her early 60s, with reading glasses perched on her nose and a reputation for cutting through nonsense. Let's get started, she said, settling behind the bench. This is an emergency motion filed by Patricia Moreno on behalf of Margaret Chen, contesting the distribution of the Robert Chen estate. Mr. Fisk, you're representing Derek Chen. Fisk stood. Yes, Your Honor. Ms. Moreno. Patricia rose. Your Honor, this case is straightforward. My client, Margaret Chen, is the legal widow of Robert Chen. Under California law, she is entitled to her full share of community property and— Objection, Fisk interrupted. Mrs. Chen was married to the deceased for less than 3 years. The property in question predates the marriage and was explicitly left to Derek Chen in the will. Judge Carver looked at Margaret, then at Derek. Is there a dispute about the will itself? Yes, Patricia said. We're contesting the validity of the will Mr. Fisk has submitted. Derek shot to his feet. That's ridiculous. My father's will is perfectly valid. Judge Carver's gaze went flat. Mr. Chen, you'll sit down and let your attorney speak, or I'll have you removed. Derek sat, his face red. Fisk cleared his throat. Your Honor, the will was properly executed, witnessed, and filed. There's no basis for contestation. Patricia opened her briefcase and removed a folder. Your Honor, I'd like to submit into evidence a certified copy of the will filed with this court on April 22nd. Fisk frowned. We've already provided that. You've provided a will, Patricia said, but not the complete will. The room went silent. Judge Carver leaned forward. Explain. Patricia handed copies to the bailiff, who distributed them. The will Mr. Fisk filed is 18 pages. The will I'm submitting is 34 pages. The missing pages contain critical amendments and codicils executed by Robert Chen in the final month of his life, amendments that fundamentally changed the distribution of his estate. Fisk's face went pale. Derek lunged forward. "That's a forgery!" "Mr. Chen," Judge Carver snapped. "One more outburst and you're out." Fisk was flipping through the pages, his hands shaking slightly. "Your Honor, I wasn't aware of any additional pages." "Then you filed an incomplete document with this court," Judge Carver said coldly. "That's either incompetence or fraud. Which is it?" The version I received from Derek Chen was—" "Don't," Derek hissed, but it was too late. Judge Carver's eyes narrowed. "You received the will from your client, not from the decedent's attorney of record," Fisk stammered. Derek provided me with what he said was the final version." Patricia stood again. "Your Honor, Robert Chen's attorney of record was Howard Breslin of Breslin and Tate. Mr. Breslin passed away last year, but his files were transferred to his partner, who has confirmed that the 34-page will I've submitted is the complete and final version executed by Robert Chen. Derek Chen was aware of this version. He deliberately withheld the amended pages." "That's a lie," Derek shouted. Judge Carver slammed her gavel. "Bailiff, remove Mr. Chen from this courtroom." "Your Honor, please," Fisk began. "Now." The bailiff moved toward Derek. Victoria grabbed his arm, whispering urgently, but Derek shook her off. "This is insane. That woman manipulated my father. She's a gold digger who—" Two more bailiffs appeared. They escorted Derek out, his voice echoing down the hallway. Victoria followed, her face white. Judge Carver turned to Fisk. "Do you need a recess to consult with your client?" Fisk looked like he wanted to sink through the floor. "Your Honor, if I could have a moment to review these documents—" "You should have reviewed them before filing," Judge Carver said. "But yes, we'll take a 15-minute recess. Use it wisely." The hallway outside the courtroom was chaos. Derek was shouting at Victoria, at Fisk, at anyone who would listen. Margaret sat on a bench near the water fountain, her hands folded, her expression calm. Patricia stood nearby, scrolling through her phone. "They're going to try to settle," Patricia said quietly. "Fisk knows he's in trouble. He'll offer you a deal to make this go away." "I don't want a deal." Patricia looked at her. "I know, but I need you to be prepared for what comes next. The full will doesn't just give you the house, it gives you control of the company, the investment accounts, the properties, everything. Derek gets a modest trust fund and nothing else. When that comes out, he's going to lose his mind. He already has. This will get worse before it gets better." Margaret met her eyes. "I know, but Robert made his choice for a reason, and I'm going to honor it." Patricia nodded. "Good. Then let's finish this." When they returned to the courtroom, Derek and Victoria were back in their seats. Derek's face was stone, his jaw clenched so tight Margaret could see the muscle twitching. Fisk looked like a man preparing for his own execution. Judge Carver resumed her seat. "Mr. Fisk, have you reviewed the complete will?" "Yes, Your Honor." His voice was barely above a whisper. "And?" The amended pages appear to be valid. If they are, then the distribution I filed was incorrect." "Incorrect?" Judge Carver's tone could have cut glass. "You filed a document with this court that omitted half of a legal will. Do you understand the severity of that?" "Yes, Your Honor. I relied on my client's representation that—" "Your client is not an attorney. You are. It was your responsibility to obtain the complete and accurate will from the proper source. You didn't. Why?" Fisk said nothing. Derek stared straight ahead. Judge Carver turned to Patricia. "Ms. Moreno, walk me through the amendments." Patricia stood. "Your Honor, the amendments are extensive, but the key provisions are as follows. First, Robert Chen revoked all prior distributions to his son, Derek Chen, except for a trust fund of $250,000 to be held until Derek turns 40. Second, he granted full ownership of the primary residence at 447 Blackwood Drive to his wife, Margaret Chen. Third, he transferred 60% controlling interest in Chen Industries to Margaret Chen, with the remaining 40% divided among long-term employees. Fourth, he liquidated all joint accounts with Derek Chen and transferred those funds into accounts solely in Margaret Chen's name. Victoria made a small sound, half gasp, half sob. Derek didn't move. Judge Carver read through the pages slowly. The courtroom was silent except for the rustle of paper. Finally, she looked up. "These amendments were executed on March 20th. witnessed by Howard Breslin and Robert Chen's accountant, Thomas Whitmore. Is Mr. Whitmore available to testify? Yes, Your Honor, Patricia said. He's waiting outside. Bring him in. The bailiff opened the door and a man in his 60s entered. Thomas Whitmore had grey hair and the careful posture of someone who'd spent his life dealing with numbers and wealthy clients. He was sworn in and took the witness stand. Patricia questioned him first. Mr. Whitmore, how long did you work with Robert Chen? 23 years. And you were present when he executed these amendments on March 20th? Yes. Can you describe his mental state at that time? Completely lucid. Weak physically but sharp mentally. He knew exactly what he was doing. Did he explain why he was making these changes? Whitmore hesitated. He said he'd discovered something. Something about Derek. Derek shot to his feet. So, Your Honor, this is hearsay. It's testimony about the decedent's state of mind and intent, Patricia countered. Completely admissible. Judge Carver nodded. Overruled. Continue, Mr. Whitmore. Whitmore took a breath. Robert told me that Derek had been embezzling from Chen Industries for at least 2 years. He'd found discrepancies in the accounts, transfers, fake invoices, shell companies. He'd hired a forensic accountant to investigate. When he confronted Derek denied everything and threatened to have Robert declared incompetent and placed in a conservatorship. That's when Robert decided to change his will. The courtroom erupted. Victoria was crying. Derek was shouting denials. Fisk sat frozen, his face grey. Judge Carver's gavel cracked like a gunshot. Order! Mr. Chen, sit down or I'll hold you in contempt. Derek collapsed into his chair, breathing hard. Patricia approached the bench. Your Honor, I have the forensic accountant's report here. It documents over $1.2 million in fraudulent transfers. I'd like to submit it into evidence. Do it, Judge Carver said grimly. Patricia handed over a thick binder. Additionally, Robert Chen made an audio recording on March 14th detailing his discoveries and his reasons for the amendments. I have the recording and a certified transcript. Play it, Judge Carver said. The bailiff set up a small speaker. Margaret watched Derek as Robert's voice filled the courtroom. Thin, tired, but absolutely certain. This is Robert Chen. I'm recording this on March 14th because I know my son will try to destroy my will after I'm gone. Derek, if you're hearing this, you need to understand something. I know what you did. I know about the transfers to Pacific Holdings. I know about the fake vendor contracts. I know about the offshore accounts. I gave you every chance to come clean, and you threatened me instead. You said you'd have me declared incompetent. You said Margaret was manipulating me. But the truth is you're the one who's been stealing from me for years. Derek's face was white. Victoria had her hand over her mouth. I'm leaving everything to Margaret because she's the only person who didn't want anything from me. She took care of me when I was dying. She listened to me. She loved me. You didn't. You just wanted my money. So here's what's going to happen. Margaret gets the house, the company, and the control you thought was yours. You get enough to live on, but that's it. Maybe it'll teach you what I failed to, that integrity matters more than wealth. If you're listening to this in court, trying to steal what I gave her, then you've learned nothing, and you deserve nothing. The recording ended. The silence was absolute. Judge Carver removed her glasses. Mr. Fisk, does your client wish to contest this will? Fisk looked at Derek. Derek's face was buried in his hands. No, Your Honor, Fisk said quietly. Then let the record reflect that the complete will of Robert Chen, dated March 20th, is hereby validated and entered into probate. All property, assets, and holdings described therein will be distributed according to his wishes. She turned to Derek. Mr. Chen, I'm referring this matter to the District Attorney for investigation of possible fraud and embezzlement. You're advised to retain criminal counsel. Derek finally looked up. His eyes found Margaret. There was no anger left in them now, only devastation. Judge Carver continued. Mrs. Chen, you are the legal owner of 447 Blackwood Drive and all associated properties. Mr. Chen, if you or anyone acting on your behalf attempts to enter that property without permission, you will be arrested for trespassing. Am I clear? Yes, Your Honor, Fisk mumbled. This hearing is adjourned. The gavel fell one last time. The investigation took 6 months. The district attorney's office assigned a prosecutor named Rachel Kim, a woman in her 30s with a reputation for dismantling white-collar crime. She subpoenaed Chen Industries records, interviewed employees, traced shell companies through 3 different states. What she found was worse than even Robert had suspected. Derek hadn't just embezzled 1.2 million. He'd stolen nearly 3 million over 4 years, funneling money through fake vendors, ghost employees and falsified expense reports. He'd forged his father's signature on transfer documents. He'd bribed an accountant to hide the discrepancies. And when Robert started asking questions, Derek had contacted a shady attorney about filing for an emergency conservatorship, claiming his father was mentally unfit. It all came out in court. Derek's trial lasted 3 weeks. Victoria testified against him in exchange for immunity. She'd known about some of the transfers, but not the full extent. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. Guilty on all counts. Derek was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison. His attorney filed an appeal, but no one expected it to succeed. Chen Industries fired him formally, though he'd already been removed from the company months earlier. His name was stripped from the building directory, his office cleared out, his access revoked. Margaret attended the sentencing. She sat in the back of the courtroom and watched as Derek was led away in handcuffs. He didn't look at her. She felt no satisfaction, no triumph. Only a deep, quiet sadness for the man Robert had hoped his son would become. 8 months after Robert's death, Margaret stood in the office that had once been his. It was on the 3rd floor of Chen Industries headquarters, overlooking the city. She'd kept most of his things, the desk, the bookshelves, the framed photographs, but she'd added her own touches, plants on the windowsill, a new rug, a bulletin board covered with notes and schedules. Patricia Moreno had helped her restructure the company. They'd promoted 3 long-term employees to executive positions, implemented new financial controls, and hired an independent auditing firm to review everything. The employees who'd received shares under Robert's will now had a voice in major decisions. It wasn't perfect, but it was better. Margaret didn't pretend to be a CEO. She wasn't. But she was a good listener, a careful decision-maker, and someone who understood what it meant to work hard for something. The company stabilized. Profits grew. People stopped whispering about the old woman who'd inherited everything and started talking about the careful steward who'd saved the company from collapse. She sold the house at 447 Blackwood Drive. It was too big, too full of memories, both good and painful. She bought a smaller place near the coast, a cottage with a garden and a view of the ocean. She visited Robert's grave once a month, bringing flowers and sitting in the quiet. One afternoon, she received a letter. It was from Derek, postmarked from the federal prison in Lompoc. She almost threw it away. But curiosity won. The letter was short. Margaret, I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I need you to know that I'm sorry. Not for losing. I deserved that. But for what I said to you. For treating you like you were nothing. For trying to take what my father wanted you to have. I was angry for so long. Angry that he married you. Angry that he gave you power I thought was mine. But the truth is, I'd already lost his respect long before you came into his life. I just didn't want to admit it. You were a better partner to him in 3 years than I was a son in 40. I see that now. I hope the company is doing well. I hope you're happy. Derek. Margaret folded the letter and put it in a drawer. She didn't write back. Maybe someday she would. But not yet. 2 years after Robert's death, Margaret sat on her porch and watched the sun set over the Pacific. The garden was blooming. Roses, lavender, jasmine. She'd hired a part-time gardener, but she still liked to work the soil herself, her hands remembering the steady, careful movements of a life spent caring for others. Her phone buzzed. A message from Patricia. Board meeting went well. Quarterly profits up 12%. You're doing great. Margaret smiled and typed back, We're doing great. She set the phone down and picked up the book she'd been reading. A mystery novel. Nothing heavy. The breeze carried the scent of salt and flowers. Somewhere down the beach, children were laughing. She thought about Robert sometimes, about the man he'd been when they met. Brilliant, stubborn, dying, but still fighting for what mattered. He'd chosen her not because she was ambitious or powerful, but because she'd sat with him in the dark hours and listened, because she'd cared when no one else did. And in return, he'd given her a chance to do something she'd never imagined, to be more than a caretaker, more than a nurse, more than the invisible old woman people underestimated. He'd given her power, not the power Derek had craved, the power to dominate, to control, but the power to choose, to build, to protect what mattered. And she'd used it well. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Margaret closed her book and stood, stretching. Tomorrow there would be meetings, decisions, responsibilities. But tonight, she was just an old woman in a garden by the sea, watching the day end, and she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Never underestimate the quiet ones. They've been listening the whole time. If this story reminded you that justice doesn't always come fast, but it comes, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about power misjudged and karma delivered. Drop a comment and tell me, have you ever been underestimated? What happened when they realized they were wrong?